My life is a transitional one. I remember growing up in the backwoods of Connecticut in the 1950s, where the only paper we took was the Vorwärts, which, believe me, didn't help you with movie listings in Norwich or New London. And my father would read the Bintel brief as we sat around the table. It took me years and years to come to this place where I realized that that was something that tied our family to tens of thousands of families, probably hundreds of thousands of families in the American past. Well, the format tonight is we've got, I guess, a Q&A. No, a semi-structured conversation in which Sam Norich, who's the publisher and chief executive officer of the Forward, who has served as executive director of the Forward Association and publisher of the Yiddish language Vorwärts since 1997, and is publisher of the English language Forward since 2000. Sam graduated from Columbia and did graduate work in political theory at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and then at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Sam will be, I guess, asking questions of or having a conversation with Liana Finck, who studied fine art and graphic design at Cooper Union. She's been a Fulbright Fellow. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Forward, and Tablet, among other publications. Her earlier publications include The Shul Detective, a graphic blog for Lilith magazine, in which she explored synagogues in New York City. This is her first book. So I'm going to call them to the front, make sure each of them gets a microphone, let them do a Q&A, and then maybe at around 7:15 or 7:20, depending on their energy and your restlessness, turn it over to the audience to then engage in the same sort of questioning of both of our panelists. So let me turn it over to Sam to start.
Thank you. Thank you, Morris. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It's really a great pleasure to be in this space. I was here for the first swearing in of new citizens of the United States that was held in this space. There have been several such ceremonies since then, and it reminded me of my turn when that happened in my family. And so it's great to be here for this evening's conversation, and especially with Liana Finck, whose amazing work I've followed for a few years now, and particularly enjoyed when she started working on the Bintel brief. The Yiddish saying is, "Eder recheb zu reden will ich sagen a paar Wörter," meaning, before I start to speak, I'd like to say a few words. A few words of background about the Forward, the Vorwärts, and the Bintel brief. The Forward was launched not far from here in 1897, moved to the Forward building, what's still called the Forward building, which we vacated in 1974, but moved to that building, had that building built for us in 1911 on the back of the Bintel brief. The Bintel brief was what made the Forward the largest circulation Jewish publication in the world in any language from the first decade of the 20th century until the 7th. In the late 60s, Ma'ariv outgrew the Forward, but the Forward was the largest, most widely read Jewish publication until then. At its peak in the 1920s, when Congress cut off immigration from Eastern Europe, it was read by 1 million people a day, had a larger circulation in those years than the New York Times, and arguably more influence. The Bintel Brief was what made it a mass circulation publication, almost immediately after its launch in 1906. It was the first advice column of its kind. It was acknowledged much later by Dear Abby as her model. It was something that was copied by other newspapers, other Yiddish and non-Yiddish newspapers, but it was sui generis. It spoke in the idiom of its readers about things that mattered to them in a way that was so vivid. It was their CNN. It was their Google. It was where they found out about what you needed to know in order to make it on these streets. It really ran the gamut from silly questions and silly answers to the heartrending, to matters of life and death, to things that would guide the life course of the people asking the questions. And what struck me when I read them was that these people weren't just asking questions to see what this editor would say, one more opinion. They asked these questions the way you ask a rabbi or a shrink or a priest. What do I do? And they fully, I mean, the tone of these questions fully indicated that they expected to follow the advice. The advice was given by one editor, Abraham Kahan, and in order to help the column in its takeoff period, he sometimes had to write some of the questions as well as the answers. But, you know, he asked questions that he knew were being asked on Hester and on Orchard. And he gave answers that made sense to these people, otherwise they wouldn't have kept coming back. So here we are, a century later, a young graphic artist comes along and makes this book out of it. It's really a completely different art form. It's a completely different medium. And the question is, what's still salient about these questions and these answers? The question is, why should any of this matter today? I mean, this is not a history book. This is for today's readers. So let me begin with that question. How did you pick the Bintel Brief as something that you would write your first book about?
It happened in an odd way, and it didn't become meaningful until a couple steps into the process. The Bintel Brief started out as a grant application. I was living in Belgium the year after college working on my opus and failing at my opus, and I was going to come home, and I thought, 3 months before I came home, I thought I might as well hedge my bets and apply for some other grants. And one of the grants I heard of was, can you all hear me, by the way? I'm a quiet person. Hi, Gideon. One of the grants I heard of was the 6 Points Fellowship for Emerging Jewish Artists, and I'd had an interesting relationship to Judaism before then, and I hadn't even, I'm not a questioner, I never liked questions, and I never rebelled, but I also never connected in a deep way, and a Jewish book was not something I would have wanted to write. I would have wanted to write about art. I would have wanted to write about poetry. Like that was what I cared about. But I thought it'll be easy to write a grant application for a Jewish book because this is stuff I know about, I've learned about. I went to Jewish schools. I was steeped in prayers. I went to synagogue. My family was pretty observant, and so I asked my parents for ideas for a Jewish project. I think I had a lot, but I just was casting a wide net, and they had an idea, and their idea was that they should sneak into my grandmother's apartment. My grandmother was in Florida at the time, and her apartment in New Jersey was empty. And they snuck in, and they looked at her bookshelf, and they found her crusty, musty copy of a Bintel brief, 60 years of letters from the Lower East Side to the Jewish Daily Forward, edited by Isaac Metzger. And they gave it to me, and I was still thinking, I am a jaded postmodernist, and I'm going to write this grant application for the book I don't want to write. And I thought I might as well read the book instead of just...
You can't make this stuff up.
Instead of just checking Wikipedia. And I opened the book, and Magic Stardust came out, and I became connected to my Judaism somehow. I can tell you more. Do you want me to tell you the next part of the story?
Yeah, go ahead.
The letters are just so great. When I said that what I cared about was art and writing, I couldn't put into words what it was about art and writing that I liked, and I realized it was actually shocking to me to read this book and realize that it contained like the things that I loved in art and writing. I think I questioned my love of art and writing when I read the book. I actually loved people. I think I loved their stories. And like honestly, I've become a people person since I opened that book. The stories are, I think I do love real advice column letters. I don't think I loved this and I wouldn't love that. I don't think this was way more serious than that, but this does happen to be a very serious advice column. The letters are often life and death. People are starving to death and writing to know what to do. People have like huge crises. Some of it is nitpicking and some of it is silly, but a lot of it is not. And I think I love the depths of that, and I also love the lightness of the letters themselves, which are written very, like in this very kind of silly way. I still don't know exactly what's silly about them. They're simple. They do have a sense of humor.
Let me illustrate. A letter came that said, a young woman writes to the editor, says, I want to look pretty and I'd like to put on makeup, but my father says it's a sin. Is it a sin?
Yeah.
A young man writes, I'm in love with this woman and I want to marry her, but I've been warned against it because she has a defect that I'm told often leads to the death of the first husband of women who have this defect. What's her defect? She has a dimple in her chin.
The devil's in the details.
Yes, and the editor writes back and he says, your problem is not a dimple in the chin, it's a loose screw in the head. But there's also columns like the newsboy who writes that he came to this country 2 years earlier. His older sister came 2 years before that, and she made enough money to send tickets to his mother and to him, and so for 2 years they were all together, and he went to school and he never missed a day. But then his sister was killed in the Triangle Fire in March of 2011, and she was one of 146 Jewish and Italian young women and young men, mostly young women, who worked in this factory off Washington Square, which went up in flames. And so he writes that ever since they suffer deeply from the misfortune, and he has to go sell newspapers, and he wants to go to school at night and sell newspapers in the day, but his mother won't hear of it. She says that they need the income, and he just has to work. And he asks for advice, and the advice is that the mother should let her son go to finish high school at night and go on to college and work during the day, and people are asked to send in some money to help the family. And that's what happened. And so the Vogels was at the nexus of this community that acted as a community. And, well, the question is, how did you pick? I mean, there are thousands of stories. How did you pick the stories you turned into graphic novels, graphic stories?
I didn't put a lot of work into picking them. I took a Yiddish class, and I knew enough Yiddish to pick out the Bintel brief from the other articles in the microfilm I was looking at, and it was very old microfilm, so I printed out the letters that I knew the translator would be able to read, and that was probably 15 letters in the first roll of microfilm. That was 1906 and 1907. And he translated, I think, 11 that he could read of those 15. And I just had a big kind of a bundle, if you will, of letters that I was adapting simultaneously. And certain of them, some of them were from the translator, the translated ones from microfilm, and some were from that book from my grandmother's apartment. And I think the ones that rose to the top, it turned out that they all had certain things in common, and I didn't realize it until I realized that they were the best adaptations of the bunch. And the things that they had in common was that I think they were all about loss in a certain way. They're all about losing the old country, like the conflict between losing the old country and coming to the new country. And a lot of them also had kind of a romantic story in them, and I found the thread of what I was trying to say by reading all these letters at the same time.
Do you want to show an example?
I need to find the clicker. So I think this is going to be the first letter in the book. It's, should we describe it first?
Yeah.
So this letter was given, Abraham Kahan had been on the lookout for something immediate to do with his newspaper to get people to feel like they were involved in the newspaper, and he didn't know quite what it was. And one day, his secretary gave him a letter from a reader, and this is the letter from the reader. Well, this is the introduction in which he says that at first he thought the letter was just like a letter from a crank, and then he realized it was this like very tactful and layered and sophisticated letter. It's called The Watch. Esteemed Mr. Editor, my son will drive me to the grave. I told him not to be such a good boy. I told him he would break my heart. But did he listen? No, he is as deaf as a wall. He worked in a sweatshop till his fingers bled. He saved every single penny until one day he had enough to buy a watch. That watch was more precious to us than diamonds. When my boy was out of work, we were able to pawn it to buy food. We never went hungry anymore. And I was experimenting with different ways. I wanted to keep all the letters like as close as possible to the letters that I read. And I was experimenting with different things I could do with the pictures while I told this pretty straightforward story. So these are illustrations of this young man going to a watch store and meeting with this kind of bully.
To a pawn shop?
No, he's buying. In my mind, it was
watch,
he's buying the watch, but he might have bought it from a pawn shop. And like the guy is I feel like the guy represents like America to an immigrant who doesn't really think he's making it yet, and he's just like crossing his arms and being like, get out of here. And then the kid just works and works, and he has enough money, and he gets what he wants finally, and he wins. And it turns out, I think you realize in the second page of the story, this whole like other story unfolding about the boy and the guy from the watch shop was taking place in this letter writer's head. I don't think you can see from there, but there's some spelling mistakes in her writing. She's not highly literate, and I don't think she knows how to choose her words so well. I don't think she has a lot of words in her head, but she has this very vivid and Gothic imagination that's like way ahead of what she's saying. So the second part of the letter is, well, Mr. Editor, yesterday the watch disappeared. I am so scared, and I don't want to point any fingers, but I do hear a certain ticking down the hall. And God help me, I fantasize, and here we get really Gothic, about knocking on my neighbor's door and asking for my son's watch back. But of course, I can't. She is even worse off than I am, and also she is my friend. If I talk to her, I will humiliate her. If I do not talk to her, my family will starve to death. So what is left for me to do? All I can think of is this. If you print my letter in your newspaper, maybe my neighbor will read it. I would like to ask her please to give the watch back. I promise we will remain friends like we always have been. So the second part of the letter, like there's the contrast between her writing, like there's a bunch of images in this book of people writing with like this craggy piece of crayon or something on a wall or in the air, and I think that represents like how hard it is for them to write. And then here's her kind of Gothic, like Piranesi meets Greek gods imagination. And she's being very tactful. She doesn't want to talk to the neighbor. She's like she's broadcasting this thing to the world, but she's also doing the most subtle and tactful thing possible.
It strikes me that there's an aspect of social media in this. That this is like Facebook 100 years before Facebook. She doesn't want to confront the neighbor. She knows whom she has to confront, but she won't do it, and she relies on the community in this forum that the newspaper represents to make it happen for her, and it happens.
Yeah.
These stories are not stories of Jews making it in America. These are not stories of, it was hard, but then, we overcame all that. These are stories that are really steeped in the time when it was just hard. And I'm wondering, why you gravitated towards those.
I think the same reason I gravitate to books and art in general. I think for whatever reason I was more attuned to like the hard things than to the easy things. I think when I was a kid I always thought I was living in this, I was like going through a tragedy when I wasn't. If I had some dirt on my face, the next like 2 weeks I'd be obsessed with that. And I know that's pretty normal, maybe because most of my friends are also artists and writers now. That seems like run of the mill, but I think when you read a book about someone who has real problems, it's cathartic because you relate, and it's not like you feel like you're reading. This is proof that it's not all in your head, and you're not like hiding your real life from the world anymore.
I wanted to ask you about Abraham Cahan. Cahan becomes another character in your book, and you give him a certain personality and a certain look, and even there's a frisson of flirtation there, and I'm wondering how that came to be.
For the flirtation, I think that's because I wrote it when I was a little bit younger, and I can't speak to that anymore. But
that was then.
Yeah. There might be a page here. Here's the answer to. But the answer to the first question isn't that interesting. It's just telling how amazing the letter is and paving the way for the Bintel brief. Yeah, here's one of the in-between pages in which that's what happens after this character of Abraham Cahan comes out of a notebook full of newspaper clippings that my grandmother gives me, and he just starts, he kind of nags me because I don't speak Yiddish, and he reads me the first letter, and then I get really into it. And I'm like, oh, I can't read anything we're saying, but I'm like, tell me more. And he's like, what's in your fridge? And I'm like, he's like, is there any borscht in there? And I'm like, no. Do you want to eat sushi? And he's like, sushi. And that's the beginning of what happens in this story, which is, it's like, I think at the very, very beginning, it starts off as kind of a cat and mouse, where he's the cat and I'm the mouse, and eating the mouse is a metaphor for teaching the mouse about Yiddish culture. But it switches very quickly, and I become the cat and he becomes the mouse, and I want to learn from him, and all he wants is to discover what is sushi, and like which I think was what the real Abraham Kahan was like. So actually, this really is a metaphor not for my relationship to Judaism per se, but maybe to our generation's relationship to Judaism. Like, we want to learn more, and the minute we reach for it, it evaporates. We don't even know what we're looking for anymore. But I guess there was a metaphor with relationships that I had, which is probably why the romance came into the picture. He does have a very attractive mustache.
What struck me about this was that you didn't repeat the Bintel brief stories. It wasn't just, aping forebears. It was really making it in your own voice and creating interactions and emotion that came from you, not from the page you were reading. And I think there's no carrying on of tradition except that way. Either it works that way or it doesn't work. Should we look at another story, maybe?
Yeah, I guess we should. Father. Traitor. The night of the pogroms, I was reading outside, so I saw them coming. I ran without knowing what I was doing. That's how he escaped alone. There's his family inside seeing the pogroms coming, and here he is coming to New York. I never saw my family again. This was one of the stories I was happiest with because I was really channeling a voice that wasn't mine. Like, I was letting myself be corny in ways that I'm not and draw badly in ways that I don't necessarily need to draw badly, and it was so freeing. I can't stop thinking about my father. That's his father just like touching this disgusting wound on his upper arm. My God, says the disgusting old man. My sisters tell me he lay unconscious for 4 days. They tended to his wound. He awoke in the middle of the fourth night, crazed with grief and fever. He wandered off, and there he goes. I know my father better than anyone. I know what he thinks about on a clear night. He recalls the passage in the Torah where God tells Abraham he will have as many descendants as there are stars in the sky. My father still believes this. That is the real miracle. I made that part up. Brooklyn, New York. It was really a letter from Cleveland, Ohio, and we just thought it was, I'm not sure why we decided to change it, to make it more of a New York book. Nobody here seems aware of the betrayed shtetl ghosts that follow me around, whispering that this is not my place, that at any moment America will fall away and I'll be home again. My sisters wrote to me. They tell me that our father came back, his wound has healed. It's just that he can't move his arm. And here's a scene in which he finds out that a bunch of his kids are dead and in prison, and he's just so full of grief. But the thing that grieves him the most is that this one son went to America. He feels like it's a very unpious place, and he just collapses in a heap. I've never seen my father shed a tear. He was always such a strong man, but when my sisters told him they want to leave for America, he just dissolved. He says, "Who will I live with after you leave?" And then he says, "I won't interfere with your plans." He's being very passive-aggressive. He says, "I can tell you don't want me here." And he just leaves. He goes out wandering. And this is definitely in the letter writer's head, seeing his father wandering through this like war-torn moonscape with stars in the sky, which signify his hope despite his terrible despair. So, Mr. Editor, my sisters have written to me for advice. They tell me that they have a few dollars saved, enough for them all to come to America with our father. And his father is like going into the sky because he knows there's nowhere for him on earth anymore. But none of us can really picture him in the promised land. Learned Mr. Editor, I have faith in you and in your newspaper, and I await your reply. Sincerely, Yechiel Schlachberg, Brooklyn, New York. That's a strange story. I haven't read it in a while. And the answer is the strangest answer. He says, we can't answer this letter in public, please write to us privately. And I'm not sure if he might be offering like real help. Do you think so?
I don't know. I mean, I think it may have been politically incorrect for him to acknowledge that America meant loss and not only gain. Mm-hmm. It may have been, he may have known Schlachberg for all I know. Mm-hmm. But I think that there's such anguish in this letter. He may just not have wanted to engage it in the newspaper. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a
Poor
different
guy.
perspective on the Golden Medina.
Yeah.
The Golden Land. What's next?
I've been working on a book for a couple of years, and it's still starting. I think it's starting to come together. It's a coming-of-age story told from the point of view of a shadow who left its human and is coming back again to be the human's roommate. And
so it's the sequel to this.
yeah, it really is. Like, I think I was starting to figure out by doing this story, this in-between story with Abraham Kahan and the me character. I think it's a continuation of that.
These are obviously stories that evoke a lot of pain and a lot of the insides of their characters are brought outside. Do you want to show the faces of the disappeared husbands? Do we have that?
We don't have it in the PDF.
Oh, you got to buy the book for that.
Yeah. I could mimic them. We should describe it, though.
That's yet another art form. The Forward ran a column. We'll get to your questions in one moment. But the Forward ran a column called Disappeared Husbands.
The
gallery of
missing
husbands. Right.
What's it called in Yiddish? Do you know?
Verschwundene Männer. And Galerie von verschwundene Männer. In a previous incarnation, I was director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. And in YIVO's archives, which include the records of the Jewish Children's and Family Service, are contained the records of the National Desertion Bureau. The National Desertion Bureau was one of the largest organizations on the Lower East Side a century ago. It served to help families track down husbands, men, who had abandoned their wives and children, had abandoned alimony payments or their obligations because they just couldn't, and had fled. And the Forward, of course, was a national publication, and the people would send in the photos and a brief 4-line description of these men, and the Forward would print mugshots of these men in the hope that somebody in Lexington, Kentucky, or Boise, Idaho, or Chicago would identify them and turn them in and force them to do right by their families. So not being able to read Yiddish and to decipher all these descriptions of all these men, Liana looked deeply at the faces of these men and created a gallery of disappeared husbands, which you got to see for yourself.
They were
So, Q&A.
Sure.
Okay, what we're going to do now, hang on, don't go anywhere. So we've got some time. We've got some conversationalists. We've got some questions. And we've got a microphone back there. So if you raise your hand, Emily will bring the microphone to you. I'll ask you to speak into it, not to speak before you do, because this is going out to, it's being podcast to what? The multitudes, globally. And so we'd like to make sure that
If
you're
not more widely still.
recorded just as you are. And if any of you are, have abandoned wives and families, there'll be pictures.
Morris, this question is actually for you. You told us that your father would read the Bintel brief to the family. I'm curious what your reaction was, and did it foster a family discussion? What?
One thing about being 7 or 8 is even if you can remember what you went through, you did it as a 7 or 8-year-old. So I knew it was part of the family's experience. I knew it was something that was meaningful, but for the life of me, I mean, I'm a professional historian. I'm paid to the extent I'm paid to remember things. I haven't got the foggiest memory, so I can't help you.
And anyway, Morris may not have had a speaking role in that drama.
Right. Question?
I'm not Jewish, so I'm not sure, but I know from my Irish grandmother. Did your grandmother, when she came back from Florida, tell you any stories that would connect you and get you really thinking about what those people were going through that you would never have thought was really going on? And, like, how did you feel? Did she connect you to the history that was long before you?
This is going to be a complicated answer. I think this book is really for my grandmother and about her tactfulness and how she's not like a normal grandma. She doesn't tell too many stories. She did facilitate me getting this book, and she was born here but barely, and she changed her name in first grade to become more American, and I think it's been her life's work to be like the best version of an American, and that includes talking about the weather instead of talking about suffering and things, and even as opposed to talking about her family. So yeah, it's like whenever she does talk, it's like something you wouldn't expect, and it's wonderful. And I think the reason this book has a lot of kind of magic realism in it, more than a lot of real history, is it's kind of like what the past is like as filtered through my grandmother's talking about the weather.
Emily?
So, Liana, it was what you said was a revelation. I've seen your book a couple of times, but then something just hit me as you were speaking about one of the stories, and that is that your work is not just illustration of these stories. It takes them much beyond it and creates a whole world. You create a whole world using these stories as sort of a takeoff point, and you really, and in a visual way. So you add so much. The book adds so much to the, in a visual way, to these stories. And I really thank you for that kind of revelation. So in that vein, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking about how you took a letter and how it evolved into its final rendering. You could just choose one.
This is the first finished graphic novel that I made, and I think I realized early on that this was not a language that I speak. Drawing pictures in boxes and sequential art is not something that comes naturally to me, I think, because I didn't read comics as a kid. And I've been realizing in the past couple of years that this is kind of a common thing among women comics artists. We didn't grow up with comics. We grew up with kids' books and stuff. So I think my strength as an artist is when the pictures are saying, not like illustrating the words, but saying something very separate from the words. And I think the story I did that most fully in is kind of the weirdest one and the most free one. It's the last story in the book that's written by the young woman whose fiance was killed in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and it's just like such a sad and like fully there letter. I didn't want to illustrate each line, and like there was nothing to add. And so I just drew this young woman like writing the text in the air. And it became a lot more of, I made two stories going side by side. One was the words in the air telling her story, and one was her lying in a bed. And I drew this. She mentions the angel of death once, maybe twice in her letter, and I drew the angel of death as this like stick figure who's like trying to get into bed with her. And it was this mixture that I was very comfortable with as I was working on this book, maybe in general, maybe just because I was a younger woman, of like gruesome horror mixed with silliness. I like to do a takeoff. I like to read. I really admire book cover designers. I feel like I like when people can read a whole book and then just go into this wordless space and come up with a picture that has something to do with the book, but not directly. And I think in that story I was doing that.
So I didn't know until today that you had taken some license with the stories, changing locations and adding things that the characters were thinking that maybe weren't included in the source material. And I'm curious, when you were doing that, whenever you would add some sort of license to the actual source material, what were the guiding motivations? Was it to enhance the storytelling? Was it to convey, larger themes that you saw in your research but that didn't come out in this particular letter? Just because I find that fascinating, just because I was reading it sort of more like history, and to learn sort of the license that gets taken, I'm curious about where that comes from.
Yeah, there was a lot more license taken early on. These were, I pitched the book in the grant application as history, and then I suddenly was afraid because I'm not someone who writes the truth ever. I'm like someone who makes stories, and I realized this will probably be a better book if I take a lot of license and just do a lot of stories and call it a Bintel brief. So I did that, and after I did that, I realized that the original letters were much better than the stories I'd made up. And I think that story that I just showed on the PowerPoint is the one that got away. Like it has the most fiction still in it. And I have no idea why we did Brooklyn instead of Cleveland. That was changed later. I don't think I changed that. I think we wanted this to be a New York book, and I wish I hadn't done that. I still think of it as a Cleveland story.
How long did the Bintel brief run? And over the years, was there a change in the kind of letters, the kind of problems that were in the letters?
The Bintel brief ran well into the 1970s. And there was a change because most of the readership grew older. You know, the children of the immigrants didn't need or want a Yiddish language newspaper. In fact, until late, really the 1970s and 80s, these people were trying to get as far away from Yiddish as they could, as quickly as they could. The young people going on the subway to City College in the 20s did not want to be caught dead reading a Yiddish newspaper. But the older people continued to turn for advice, and the kinds of issues, of course, changed from young people's questions to old people's questions. The forward is today, since 6 weeks ago, we've restarted an advice column. It's not called the Bintel Brief. It's called the Seesaw, and it's an advice column about interfaith issues. And unlike the old Bintel Brief, the advice comes not from some editor on high, but rather from 2 or 3 out of a group of 8 people, who 2 or 3 of whom answer each letter from different perspectives. Among the 8 are 2 who are not Jewish, and that's the way we live today. And these are issues. I mean, there were interfaith questions in the 1930s, but it was a different time. Now they're really quite prevalent in a way that they weren't back then. Then it was quite unusual. So we think that a newspaper, a website, most of the people who read us don't read us in print, they read us on a screen. But we still serve the purpose of a newspaper, and that is to provide information that others don't, to ask questions that others don't, and to foster a conversation that others mostly don't.
Hi. What have you learned about yourself as an artist or storyteller by doing this project?
That's for you.
The middle part of this book is the last part that I did. The part it's a much freer and much more conversational part in which a character that's based on me is talking to this ghost with the heart-shaped face. And I had so much fun working on that. And I think I did an adaptation for this first book because I kind of, with the book before it, I kind of overstepped by trying to write like a really ornate novel with a lot of strands, and I was shaky as a comics artist, and it was too many things to worry about, and I hit so many snags and I couldn't finish it, and I thought I need to adapt something that's already there while I learn my craft. And making the Bintel brief letters was really hard. Like I think it was like a really hard exercise, and it was good for me, but I also learned that I want to chase the easy thing from now on, and I think the middle thing is the middle part was much easier, the fiction part. And I also learned that I don't need to work in boxes. I can be a comics artist who writes and illustrates underneath. There are a million ways to be a comics artist. I think that's going to become more apparent, and like this field is moving so fast, I think we're figuring that out all together. And oh gosh, what else? I don't know. I love doing the guy with the heart-shaped face. I want to learn how to be more cartoony. I think sometimes a person will draw more realistically because she's afraid of straying from reality and doing something weird. So I think as I become more confident, I'll also become more cartoony.
We have time for one more question. Right in front of you.
Is there any letters that you came across that you could see yourself writing to this guy, either as a young girl, as you growing up, or whatever age?
It's interesting. Yes, I feel like all of them. I guess I related more to the letters in which there was real tragedy, but I think the real me would write one of the more neurotic letters in which there's not tragedy. There were some letters. There was a letter from a woman who, this is something I changed also, but I'm proud that I changed it. I changed her signature to a spider, but she actually signed a criminal. I didn't think it translated right. She was writing because she'd married a man with tuberculosis, and she wasn't a great wife to him, she said, and she felt like she was killing him, and that seems like something that I would obsess over. Like, I'm just this random guilt. You're doing the best you can, but really the person I related to the most in some ways was Abraham Kahan. I think I related to his love he loved the letters, and I related to him loving the letters, and he walked this tightrope between ivory tower, high art, and like wanting to be one of the people and to help them tell their stories. And I think as an artist, I was relating to him.
I'm going to ask the last question. Sam, when did Kahan stop writing the answers, and who then replaced him?
I don't think there's any record of that. He was the editor-in-chief until his dying day at the age of 91 in 1951. But in fact, Hilla Rogov had assumed most of the responsibilities of editor in the mid-late 40s, around 47. But he regarded this as core to his achievement. He came out of a Russian realist tradition. He wanted to somehow convey the voices of his readers in the paper, and not simply talk to them, but get them into the paper. And I think that's why he figured that out. That's why it was so successful. People read it to read their own voices. And I think Rogov and others who may have had a hand in it understood that this is really about the readers, and it's not a place where you introduce style and art and editorial judgment. I mean, there's some editorial judgment, of course, in the selection of the letters, but the letters spoke for themselves.
Yeah, I heard that he really stopped answering them after a year or two, but it wasn't. I think he set the answers up so that they would just be very wise and concise, and not just in the voice of like the great Oz.
And on that note, thank you, Liana. Thank you, Sam.
Buy the book.
And what I'm going to do is now say that the book is available for sale at the checkout counter. I want to thank you all for coming, for really gracing us with your presence this evening here at the Tenement Museum. And good night.